Today, we are going to be talking about a really fun topic. Did humans always have consciousness, or is it more of a cultural invention? So, the topic comes to me from the book The Origin of Consciousness, which was written in 1976 by Julian Jaynes. And this was a really exploratory exercise on what is human consciousness. So James starts out by talking about what consciousness is not. So it's not a wakefulness or an awareness. It's not intelligence or problem solving. Consciousness is an inner narration, metaphorically, an introspection. And what James is arguing or suggesting is that consciousness emerged around 3,000 years ago. What we would call consciousness in the human emerged around 3,000 years ago. That it's not this innate experience in the human body, but that it's a culturally driven evolution in how humans perceive and interact with the external world. And at the heart of his understanding is what's called the bicameral mind. This is what the mind was like in pre-conscious times. And bicameral meaning the two chambers of the brain. So how he breaks it down is essentially prior to this heightened level of consciousness on the planet or within the species, there was this bicameral mind. So there was a what he considered the left brain and the right brain. And I think it's pertinent to understand that modern science doesn't necessarily agree with this idea of the left brain being the logical, rational mind, and the brain being the kind of orthogonal, introspective, kind of deep thinking brain. But that there's different parts and portions of each part of the brain that are in there. And there's a logical portion of the brain. It doesn't necessarily have to be contained in the left hemisphere, but there is technically a bicameral experience of the brain where you have a super logical, five sense reality based experience of the world, and then you have a much more ethereal, artsy, less concrete experience of the world, and that those parts of the mind can communicate. And what James suggests is that, and what he uses is the right hemisphere and left hemisphere, is that essentially the right hemisphere generated these auditory hallucinations. This was what people considered before 3,000 years the divine commands. When somebody said they were speaking to God, when Noah said he went to the mountaintop and spoke with God or communed with God or the angels, that what was really happening was there was um, an idea that was generated in the right side of the brain, and because the corpus callosum hadn't fully developed, the part of the brain that mediates communication between the left and right hemispheres, that what people took as this external thought was just coming from their right brain. And then when it got over to the left brain, it was um, concretized, it was broken down, it was understood. And that's how people viewed the world, that there was this external God or ancestors or some kind of energy or being that was speaking to them from past, from a distance, not that wasn't existing in their current reality. And what James kind of suggested is that this experience was part of the evolution in the human species, that this was an evolution from prior terms, which probably had the human species almost as an input output system. There was no, it couldn't experience the right hemisphere on a conscious level because the reticular activating system was probably editing out all of the information and inputs and outputs that the right brain was having because the humans were so focused on survival, on living, on experiencing another day. And they didn't have the ability to get into that parasympathetic state, which allows you to access the right hemisphere, which then allows you to access what I think most people would consider your sixth senses, your intuition, your ability to feel energy and feel other people and how they're experiencing the world. And what James kind of suggested is that, this was the basis for decision making, for religion, for social cohesion. There was somebody who got to a conscious enough level to have this bicameral experience where their right brain created ideas and then imparted them through the corpus callosum into the left brain. And that person essentially was in communion with God. That person was in charge and they set all the rules. And they set these rules through this bicameral experience. And again, I don't think it's, first off, the critics were very open about the fact that there's really no physical evidence that when you go back 3,000 years, you can't test this hypothesis. But what they do say is that, they applauded him for the thought-provoking experiment that it does create. And I think that's where what I want to kind of take away from this is this thought experiment of, is consciousness this innate thing that happens in humans, or is it a socially brought about experience that can be developed as we move through different levels of society, as we move to and from, as the pendulum swings from this deep connection to the intelligences that exist outside of our brain or that exist in the deep-seated right side of our brain that is not as rational, that is kind of abstract in its thinking. And in that abstractness, is it noticing patterns that the left brain is not capable of noticing? Is it noticing patterns of the downfall of society, that the way that we're doing things is not the right way to be doing things? And you could call that accessing information from higher self, from intelligences beyond our ability to know. And again, you could also argue that the right brain is just a receiver for this information, that there is actually information. It's not a hallucination within the mind, but it's a hallucination coming from access to information outside of the mind that is filtered in and through the right brain, through that orthogonal thinking mind that not everybody may have access to. And if it's a social creation, well, then in one lifetime, you can change the social belief systems that you have. So you can go from believing that, there is nothing outside of the five sense reality, and then have experiences that allow you to experience something beyond what you thought was possible, and then to integrate that into your social understanding. And then all of a sudden, now you're able to access this information that is either stored in the right brain that we don't have access to because our reticular activating system is editing it out, or that we have access to this information that's coming from the universe, from God, from wherever, from a higher thinking being, from a future version of ourself, from something that we are quantumly entangled with. And that this is how we are advancing our society, when humans have this ability to see past the current state with which we are existing in, to envision, to imagine, to believe in, to create in their minds a future that they want to experience. and that's all coming from the right brain through the bicameral experience of the mind into the left brain so that you can think, ration, and take away some type of information with this. So what James is suggesting and how consciousness has emerged is essentially that it developed culturally through metaphor, through language, through storytelling. And he brings up the idea of the Iliad. In the Iliad, all the main characters are getting their motivations from the gods. The gods are telling them to set sail, go to a new island, go on these great adventures because the gods are telling them to go do that. And you can imagine that in a society that was struggling, that felt like you were in a cage, this voice inside of you starting to tell you, hey, it's time to move on. It's time to get out. It's time to go explore a new reality. And that is what the Iliad kind of portrays. And, that's kind of the basis for how this consciousness emerged. And then at some point, humans became self-aware. They internalized this narrator that was essentially replacing those external gods for their internal voice, for the voice that's inside of them, that's moving them towards their goals in life. And that was a shift from this external belief in gods that were guiding the humans to an internal belief of the voice inside of them that is guiding them. And I think there's, at this point, we're really not too sure which one it would be. I don't think there's a debate on there that there is some force, something that is moving, pushing, if you slow down enough. And again, I think this is a part of the equation, is that if you are capable of slowing down and getting out of the fight or flight, because like I mentioned before, the reason that a lot of humans weren't experiencing this bicameral mind, this voice of God, was because they were in a almost constant state of fight or flight. They had animals that were attacking them. They had to find food, famine, disease, all of these things were a part of their life. And when you're in that level of awareness, when you're in the fight or flight state, the access to the intelligence of the right brain, the intuition, your ability to communicate with other beings, again, however you're kind of interpreting this, it's just not possible. Your reticular activating system is focusing your energy and your awareness on what is keeping you alive, and you don't have time for these higher thinking, higher rationalizing, higher consciousness explorations. So that was one evolution. And now I think we're kind of back in, and I would probably argue that again, I think everything is a wave. There's an up and a down and an up and a down, and there might be a tendency of increasing, but you go up and down through that experience. So what I think, and where I think we were at, was we're we're on this upward trajectory towards a higher consciousness, but that there was a dip in consciousness that precedes an explosion or an expansion of consciousness. And the 18th and 19th centuries seem to have been this general lowering of consciousness where we focused most of our beliefs and our energy on a five sense reality. The quantum mechanics, quantum physics was not a thing at that point, and we had also obliterated this belief in a divine being that was guiding us as well. And we came into this place where we were just physical beings having an physical experience without any connection to anything outside of that. And that was, again, it put us into this place where there was no direction. We weren't really sure which way we were moving. And the I would say that the overall theme that was pushing humanity was to create a better world for the next generation. And that seemed to have gotten lost as one generation after another got more and more comfortable. There was no drive to create or change the systems that we had or that we had built. There was no drive because everybody was so comfortable. At least in the first world, there were so many people that were comfortable, and there was a pervasive idea that the only way to allow the spread of information, or the only way for consciousness or for us to experience a better future was through some type of religious or some type of societal framework. So in the West, the societal framework is and continues to be more or less some type of capitalism, whether it's social capitalism, whether it's um, pure capitalism, whether it is crony capitalism. But there's this idea that this framework and structure is the only way to make a better tomorrow for our children. And I think we're pushing up, and there's a lot of people that are realizing that either what we call capitalism is not the pathway. This kind of crony capitalism, this fake capitalism that has come about, especially in the last 50 or so years, or that maybe there's a new framework, a framework that is outside of capitalism that could work. And this was the birth of socialism. Again, empirically, it does not seem as if socialism works. You can't continue to have poor outcomes and believe that it was just the people that were in charge for that to believe that, it's not the system that was broken, it was the people in the system that was broken. I think there has to be some accountability on the system, not just the people that are running the system. Again, that's a whole nother topic that we can get into. But the point of the conversation is that there was this idea that there's only one framework that would allow us to move forward, us to continue our pursuit of a higher version of society than was. And right now, we're in this midst of understanding or figuring out what that next iteration might look like. This is the birth of the new earth. This is the birth of a new way of being, is figuring out, okay, this system is not working. It's not providing value for enough people where they want to continue it. So what is the new system? How do we build a new system? Are there incentives to keep the old system that are created by people who have the most power and money? And how do we work around that as well? So to view this whole idea of the bicameral mind and where we are in the evolution of consciousness, I think it's very important because, it suggests, and it, I think, more or less shows that consciousness is a societal output, that consciousness is created within the society that you exist in, that in the 19th and 20th century, we kind of went through this, I would say, lowering of consciousness, that we were less connected to, God had died. Nietzsche says this is the death of God. And there wasn't a widespread understanding of quantum mechanics and quantum physics, which gave us this idea that we can have communication or a connection to a multitude of realities, a multitude of experiences, that it's the observer that creates the reality, not the reality that is observed by the observer. And that created this interesting experience of, a need to blossom, to bloom, to explore what is truly consciousness and what truly is reality. And that's where we're at. I think that's where we are in the human experience. So let me know what your thoughts are. shoot me a message, write a little comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the bicameral mind, the idea that consciousness is a construct, or at least is generally tied to the beliefs of the society. And I think that's a better way to phrase it, that it's not necessarily a societal construct. Consciousness is pervasive throughout every experience of reality. But the awareness of and the way that we view consciousness and use it to construct the reality that we live in changes from society to society. And that is true, between different countries, between different groups, between different religious experience or religious groups, that the understanding of how consciousness works changes through all those different ones. And it comes down to an individual level as well. You might be in the same country, the same religious perspective, you might have all the same things, but one person may have a deep, deep, deep understanding of what consciousness truly is, and the other may just be reading from a book that makes them look as if they are conscious, much like AI looks as if it is conscious, but it's just reading and has access to much more information than any one particular human would have. So it looks as if it's conscious, but it does not seem to be from a true consciousness perspective. It does not seem to have consciousness. So let me know. Let me know what you think. I love sharing these ideas. I love sharing these videos. And if you ever want to have a conversation, if you ever want to talk, reach out to me. I'd love to just spitball, shoot ideas around, and enjoy. So thanks for joining me today. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.